So, Alone, today we're going to talk about what is known in linear algebra as the Rank-Nullity Theorem. Sometimes, it's called really dramatic names, like the fundamental theorem of linear algebra. I wouldn't say it's like the fundamental theorem. There are obviously like a lot of really important theorems, but this is certainly like one of the most important. And like the statement of this is pretty simple. All it says is that for a linear map, from two vector spaces, the dimension of like the vector space that F maps from is equal to the dimension of like the kernel of this linear map, and the kernel is just, let me define it. The kernel is just the set of all vectors in the originating vector space such that the linear map F maps it to 0. And like we add this with the rank of this linear map, so hence the rank. And the rank of this linear map is just basically the dimension of the vector space that F maps elements of V to. And like the thing is, a linear map is a function, and a function does not have to be surjective. It can just map V into like an extreme point. In the extreme case, like a function might just map. For example, you can just define a linear map that just maps every vector to 0, and like it's still a linear map. Like you can still add two elements, 0 plus 0. You can still scale it, and it's still gonna be like 0. But it's still a linear map. You can check it yourself. But like it does, like a linear map does not have to be surjective. It doesn't have to map to every element of like the vector space we're mapping to. You can just map to like a subset of it, and like sometimes this subset might be like really really small, like obviously. So like in the example of f of v equals 0, like the 0 map, it just maps it to like the 0 element, like literally a 0-dimensional like subspace of w. So like it doesn't have to be surjective. So like the dimension of like the rank is not necessarily equal to like the dimension of like the space we're mapping to, but like the Rank-Nullity theorem like gives us an easy way to relate like both the dimension of the kernel and the dimension of like the range of, sometimes this is called the null space, hence like the name nullity, but kernel is just like shorter to write and pronounce. So, and I'm lazy, so actually this is in the definition. Kind of got tunnel vision a bit. So like the range of like f is just like all the set of all vectors like in W such that there exists a V in V such that f of V equals W. So like in the dimension of this space is called the rank. But let's gain an intuitive understanding of this theorem, and like let's take a look at like this very simple linear map. F from R2 to R2, so two-dimensional space. And let's just say F maps V1. Sorry. Let's say F maps V1, V2 to V1, 0. Well, the dimension of like R2, the underlying space, like that, like F maps from, is equal to the dimension of the kernel of F plus the dimension of the room, like, or the rank of F. Sometimes range is called the image, but we're just gonna use range. So, like I said, like even though kernel was shorter, I'm still using like this long ass word range rather than just saying like image or im as it's notated. I'm not even like uniformly lazy, unfortunately. But the kernel of this space is really simple. It's just like the set of all vectors such that the first component is 0, in which case like the doesn't matter what the second component is, like the resulting like space is just going to be like the resulting like vector is just going to be 0. So if we have like 0 v2, then it's just going to map to 0. But like if you have any like non-zero element in this first component, then it's not going to map to 0. So if we have v1 v1 v2, well, and like v1 is not equal to 0, well, this isn't going to be 0 as well. So like the kernel of this, the dimension of the kernel of this is 1. So, and let's consider like what the dimension of the range of this vector is. Well, to represent like the range of this vector, this is basically just a set of all vectors in R2, such that like no, wrong notation. So R2 such that V2 equals 0. And like in this case, like it's basically the set of all vectors, like the range of the space is basically just the set of all vectors with a potentially non-zero first component, but like the second component is guaranteed to be 0. So it has a really, like, you can't just have a very simple basis vector for like the range, which case like the basis vector for the range of f is just 1 0, and then like every multiple of 1 0 is like a potential output of this function. So like since like the second element's guaranteed to be 0, while like the first one is free to vary, so like the span of the space is any vector, like any component, like any element in the first component, and then the second like component is just 0. Well, it's only like another one-dimensional space, and we know the dimension of like R2 is 2. So we have this equation, like dimension of R2 is equal to dimension of the kernel, which is 1, plus the rank of this map which is 1. It adds up. But let's actually like view it a bit more abstractly. So, and like really see like what the Rank-Nullity Theorem like suggests to us. So keep this equation in mind. So like let's rearrange the Rank-Nullity Theorem a bit. So in this case, it's just going to be the dimension of the kernel of f equals the dimension of like v minus the dimension of the range of f. Well, we have let's say a linear map from R2 to R2. R2 is like infinitely like many vectors, obviously. But like aside from that, any linear map f from R2 to R2 doesn't have to like map onto this whole space. It might not be surjective. It can just map like elements into like kind of like a smaller section, like a subspace of this. So in the case of like the map we considered earlier, it maps it to like vectors where the first component is non-zero, but it never maps into a vector where the second component is non-zero. It's always 0. So like there's a part of the space that this linear map does not map to. It's not surjective. And like you can think of like the 0 vector like thing, like consider that like in our original function or linear map. It is a linear map. You can verify it yourself. Like consider that like it, as long as like the first component is 0, then like f is just going to map this vector to f is just going to map like sorry f is just going to map this vector to 0. So like regardless of what v2 is, it's just going to map to like the 0 vector. Well, you can kind of think of like the kernel of the space as kind of like the if you've never like used Windows before, if you're a Windows user, well, like the recycle bin, right? When you have to free up your hard drive after downloading a shit ton of 100 GB games that you've played once. Well, you can think about like the kernel of the space as like the subset of like vectors that, or the subspace of vectors that f sends to like the garbage bin. Like f just sets to 0. Like 0 obviously provides like no information, like other than 0. So like we're basically saying, let's just highlight this. So like we're basically saying this subset, like we're gonna chuck you out. We're just going to like we're just gonna like jettison you. Like we're setting you to like a irrelevant vector, while like the non-zero elements, let's actually use a different color. Well, like the non-zero, like the subset of v that maps to like the non-zero vector, like they actually matter. Like they actually like carry information, and like this is like what we can think of as like and like the space of like the vectors that And the space of vectors that are mapped to like non-zero vectors, well, those are the vectors like that actually matter, and like the dimension of like this space is like the range. So like in doing like in mapping, like we preserve some of the vectors. We actually like map some of the vectors to like useful vectors that aren't zero, and then we just like jettison some of the vectors, which which are sent to zero, and zero is like our recycle bin. Well, this equation is basically saying the dimension of like whatever's in the recycle bin is like the dimension of like our like originating vector space minus the dimension of like the of like of like the information we want to keep, like the range of the space. And like the rest of the vectors, they're just sent to zero. Like they're just destroyed. So like this is basically saying the dimension of like the things are destroyed is the dimension of like what we have originally minus the dimension of the things we want to keep. So that's like a more intuitive way of looking at it.